Every Friday morning, Charlotte Whitaker knelt at the same stretch of river, pressed her palms into the cold mud, and whispered her dead brother's name into the water. She never cried. She just knelt, a big, round-faced woman that the whole town of Harlow Creek had already decided didn't belong, and stayed until she felt something close to peace. Nobody ever asked why. Nobody ever thought she was worth asking. Until the loneliest cowboy in Wyoming finally did. If this story reaches your heart, subscribe to our channel. Follow Charlotte all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1884 came to Harlow Creek, Wyoming like a punishment. The ground cracked before June was even halfway through. The creek that gave the town its name shrank to a narrow ribbon of brown water that barely covered a man's boot heel. Cattle dropped weight fast. Gardens burned up in the soil before anything could root. And the people who had built their lives around that small Wyoming valley grew mean and tight-mouthed in the heat, the way desperate people always do when the land stops cooperating. Charlotte Whitaker arrived on a Tuesday. She came down from the supply wagon with a canvas bag in each hand and a carpet bag strapped across her back, and she moved slowly because the wagon step was high and her body was not built for quick movements. She was 24 years old, round-faced and soft-figured, with dark brown hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed traveling hat, and blue eyes that had seen considerably more sorrow than a young woman's eyes ought to carry. She was not small. She had never been small. Her hips were wide, her arms full, her waist the kind that no corset could coax into fashionable narrowness, and she had long since stopped trying. She stood on the main street of Harlow Creek for exactly 43 seconds before the first comment reached her ears. "Lord have mercy." A woman's voice, low, but not low enough. Did she think they were hiring for a cattle drive or a cook position? Laughter, not from everyone, but enough. Charlotte set her bags down on the boardwalk, straightened her back, and looked in the direction the voice had come from. Two women stood in front of the dry goods store, their skirts pressed and their bonnets tied just so, watching her the way people watch something unusual that has wandered into town. She did not look away first. She held their gaze for a full 3 seconds, long enough to make the taller of the two women shift uncomfortably, and then she picked her bags back up, turned and walked toward the posting board where she had been told job notices were kept. She had not come to Harlow Creek to make friends. She had come because she had $12 left, no family, and a letter in her coat pocket that said the Harrison Ranch was looking for a cook. She pulled the notice from the board herself. She had already memorized the words from the copy posted in Cheyenne, but she read it again anyway. Harrison Ranch. Seeking experienced cook. Room and board provided. Inquire with foreman Hector Reyes. Sundays or Tuesdays. It was a Tuesday. She asked for directions to the ranch at the general store. The man behind the counter, stocky with a walrus mustache and small eyes, looked her over slowly before he answered. Not with cruelty exactly, but with the particular blankness of a man who has already decided a thing before you have opened your mouth. Harrison Ranch is 4 miles north, he said. You got a horse? No. Wagon fare. I walked from the drop point. He looked at her again. At her bags. At her boots, which were good boots, resoled twice but still holding. Hector Reyes handles the hiring, he said. Don't get your hopes up, miss. Harrison's picky. I'm not concerned with his preferences, Charlotte said. I'm concerned with the job. She thanked him and walked out. The 4 miles north took her an hour and 40 minutes in the heat. She stopped once at a trough near a fence line to splash water on her wrists and the back of her neck. A group of ranch hands working the fence 50 yards away watched her without speaking. She did not look in their direction. She arrived at the Harrison Ranch just past noon. The ranch was large, larger than she had expected. The main house sat on a rise overlooking a sprawl of fenced pasture and outbuildings, solid and well kept in the way that comes from money and discipline, both working in the same direction. There were horses in the near paddock, a dozen or more, and even from the gate, Charlotte could see they were quality animals, well-muscled, clean-hoofed, alert. She was looking at a gray mare near the fence when a man's voice came from behind her. You're standing at the wrong gate. She turned. The man who had spoken was somewhere in the middle of his 30s, lean and weathered with the dark eyes and careful posture of someone who had spent a great deal of his life outdoors and very little of it at ease. He was not William Harrison, his shirt marked him as a working hand, and there was nothing about him that suggested ownership. But there was authority in the way he held himself, and when he looked at her, he actually looked not past her. "Hector Reyes?" she asked. "That's right." "Charlotte Whitaker. I'm here about the cook position." He looked at the notice she held out. He looked at her. Not at her body specifically, not the way the man in the store had, but at her face, at her hands, at the way she was standing in spite of what had clearly been a long and unpleasant walk in the July heat. "You cook for a large household before?" he asked. "6 years. First for my father, then for a family of 7 in St. Joseph, then for the Hargrove boarding house in Cheyenne. I can provide names." "Hargroves?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "Hargrove runs a tight house." "He does." "Come on in," Hector said. "I'll walk you through to the kitchen." The kitchen was enormous, and in a state of chaos that told the story clearly. Whoever had been cooking here before had either left suddenly or been let go in a hurry. Charlotte moved through the room without speaking, opening the pantry, checking the stove, looking at what was stored and what was not. "How many mouths?" she asked. "Main table feeds 12 on a regular day. Could be 16 in busy season." "Who was here before me?" Hector hesitated. "Young woman named Agnes. She left 3 weeks ago." Charlotte waited. "The work was hard," he added, "and some of the men weren't respectful." "I see." She checked the flour bin, found it half full and pest-free. "I expect respect as a condition of employment, Mr. Reyes, not as a courtesy. If that's not something the ranch can provide, I'll know now rather than later." Hector looked at her for a moment, with an expression she would come to understand was rare on him, something approaching surprise. "That's fair," he said. "What's the wage?" he told her. It was low. Not insultingly so, but low enough that she negotiated without embarrassment, asking for $3 more per month and a half day on Sundays. He took it to the owner. She waited in the kitchen. She heard the conversation from 2 rooms away, not every word but enough. A voice she hadn't heard yet, deeper than Hector's, and with a stillness in it that reminded her of certain types of weather. Questions about her background. A pause. Then, "Fine. Trial month. She works out, she stays." Hector returned. "You've got the position, for now." "For now is enough," Charlotte said. She met William Harrison that evening at supper. He came in from the south pasture with mud on his boots and dust on his hat, and the look of a man who had been solving problems since before sunrise. I was taller than she expected. She had pictured a rancher's softness, the kind that comes from managing rather than doing. There was none of that. His shoulders were broad and straight, his hands the hands of someone who still worked his own land. And when he sat down at the head of the table, the room's energy shifted the way it does when a person who carries real authority enters a space. He glanced at her when she brought out the bread. One glance, brief and assessing. Then he looked back down at whatever Hector was saying to him across the table. Charlotte served supper, a simple meal, given the state of the pantry, and listened to the men eat and talk and argue about a fence line dispute with a neighbor named Platt. She kept herself quiet and attentive the way she had learned to do in other people's houses, gathering information, learning which hands talked too much and which ones worked. After supper, when the table was cleared and the kitchen set back in order, one of the younger hands, barely 19, with a round face and the kind of grin that thought more of itself than it should, leaned in the doorway. "You make good biscuits," he said, "for someone your size." Charlotte continued washing the pot in her hands. "I mean it as a compliment," he added. "I know what you meant it as," she said. "And I know what it was. They're not the same thing. Good night." He left. Across the kitchen doorway, just outside the reach of the lamplight, William Harrison stood for a moment with a coffee cup in his hand. She didn't know he was there. He had come back for the coffee pot he'd forgotten, and instead he had stopped and listened. He didn't say anything. He just walked back out into the dark, and she didn't know he had heard a word. The first Friday came 5 days into her employment. She was up before dawn, as she was every morning, with the bread set and the coffee on, and the breakfast portions already measured. By 5:30, the kitchen was in full production. By 7, the hands had been fed and the table cleared. And then, without speaking to anyone, Charlotte Whitaker picked up a small cloth bundle from the shelf beside the door. It was always there. She had brought it with her from Cheyenne, and she walked out of the house past the near paddock, past the barn, past the fence line at the north edge of the property, and down the long slope of dry grass toward the creek. Hector watched her go from the barn door. He had planned to ask her where she was going, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that stopped him. Not unfriendliness, but a self-contained seriousness that told him this was not the kind of errand a person explains. She walked to the creek. She stood at the bank for a long time, long enough that two of the hands who saw her from the upper pasture made a comment about it and laughed and forgot her. Then she unwrapped the cloth bundle, took out a small bunch of dried wildflowers, prairie clover, goldenrod stems, dry and brittle with travel, and placed them at the edge of the water. She stood over them without bowing her head. She didn't pray, not in any way anyone could have recognized. She just stood, her hands folded at her waist, and looked at the water and let whatever she was feeling move through her in silence. Then she rewrapped the cloth bundle, turned around, and walked back to the house. She had done this every Friday since the spring of 1882. She would do it in Harlow Creek every Friday for the foreseeable future, or until she moved on again. Nobody at the Harrison Ranch knew why. Nobody asked. The second Friday was when William Harrison noticed. He was up early that day because of a problem with the water trough on the north side, and he had walked out in the gray light before anyone else was properly moving. He saw her cross the yard, watched her pass the fence line without hesitating. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and watched her disappear over the ridge. He didn't follow, but he stood there longer than he needed to, looking at the place where she had been. Jarring. Things had not been well at the Harrison Ranch for some time before Charlotte arrived. The trouble had started 18 months earlier, when Will's longtime foreman, a man named Dutch Alderman, who had run the cattle operations with uncanny precision for nearly a decade, took sick and died in the space of 3 weeks. The loss had been enormous. Dutch had known everything about those pastures, about the seasonal patterns of the grass and water, about which cattle were worth keeping and which weren't, about the neighbors and their boundary habits. Will had never realized how much of the ranch's success existed inside one man's head until that man was gone. The year that followed had been a series of expensive mistakes. The wrong cattle bought at the wrong time. A fence line extended into disputed ground, triggering a legal challenge from Platt that was still unresolved. Two hands who had been with the ranch for years left to follow better wages south. The cook Agnes had lasted 8 months before the work broke her down, and now it was the water. 3 of the creek-fed troughs on the south pasture were producing water that made the cattle sick. Not badly, not dying sick, but off their feed and weight losing in ways that added up to money leaving the ranch every week. Will had consulted 2 men about it. Both had shrugged and told him to dig new wells. Howe was standing at the problematic trough on the morning of Charlotte's second Friday walk, looking at the water and trying to understand what he was seeing, when he heard a voice behind him. "There's something upstream blocking the drainage." He turned. Charlotte was standing 3 feet away, dressed for work, still carrying the empty cloth bundle from the creek. She was looking at the trough with an expression of calm, focused attention. "What?" he said. "Whatever's killing your cattle, it's not the trough and it's not the well. The water looks the same, which means whatever's wrong with it is coming from upstream. Something in the ground or something sitting in the creek above this line." She tilted her head. "You have dead vegetation on the south bank about 40 yards up. I saw it from the ridge." He stared at her. "I grew up near water," she said in response to the look on his face. "My father ran a small mill. I know what bad drainage looks like." He opened his mouth, closed it. "I'm only mentioning it," Charlotte said, "because you've been staring at that trough for 20 minutes, and I don't think staring is going to solve it." She tucked the cloth bundle under her arm and walked back toward the house. Will Harrison stood at the trough for another full minute. Then he walked upstream. He found it 40 yards up, just where she had set a cluster of dead growth and disturbed ground, where a tree had fallen the previous autumn and begun to rot into the creek. The runoff from the decay was contaminating the water supply. It took him and 2 hands half a day to clear it. When the trough water ran clean, 3 days later, he noticed. He didn't say anything to Charlotte directly, but she saw him pause in the kitchen doorway on his way to supper, looking at her with something working in his face that wasn't quite comfort, but was moving in that direction. Then he walked on. The trouble with Victoria Caldwell happened in the 3rd week. Victoria Caldwell was the owner of the 2nd largest spread in the valley, a widow of 42, who wore her wealth like a second skin, and who had long assumed, not without cause, that Will Harrison's ranch and her own were moving toward a merger, financial or otherwise. She came to Sunday supper every other week with the regularity of a business appointment, and she brought with her the sort of smile that communicated exactly how seriously she took everyone else in the room. Charlotte had been cooking for 2 weeks when Victoria arrived for one of these suppers. She walked into the kitchen before the meal, which no guest had any business doing, and looked around with the slow appraisal of someone who has already decided what they think. "You're the new cook," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Charlotte was rolling dough and did not stop. "Hector told me he'd found someone." Victoria paused. "I imagined someone more local. I'm originally from Missouri," Charlotte said. "I don't know if that qualifies as local by your standards." Victoria's gaze moved over her with the careful deliberateness of an insult dressed as observation. "Tell me, do they grow them hardy in Missouri, or is it just you?" Charlotte pressed the rolling pin flat and even. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said without looking up, "I have 8 people's worth of supper to finish in the next 40 minutes. If you'd like to ask me something useful, I'm happy to answer. If not, I'd be grateful for the room." Silence. Victoria Caldwell was not a woman who had been spoken to like that in a very long time. The shock of it, more than the rudeness, held her still for a moment. Then she turned and left. Charlotte let out a slow breath and rolled the dough. 20 minutes later, when supper was served and the table was settled, she heard Victoria's voice from the dining room, with the carrying quality of someone who has adjusted her volume for an audience. "That woman is extraordinarily impertinent for a hired cook." A pause. Will Harrison's voice, measured and even. "She's extraordinarily good at her job, Victoria." Another pause. "She spoke to me. I don't know what passed between you," Will said, "but I know my kitchen runs better than it has in 3 years, and I'm not inclined to interfere with what's working." Charlotte stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the wall. Nobody had done that for her before. Not in 6 years of cooking in other people's houses. Not in a single one of the positions she had held since her father died and left her to manage on her own. No one had ever sat at a table and said plainly and without apology, "That is my cook, and she is good at her job." She pressed her palms flat on the counter. She did not cry. She had not cried in 2 years, and she was not about to start in a man's kitchen. But something shifted in her chest that evening. Something that had been held tight for a very long time. Moved slightly like a door that hasn't been opened in years, giving just a fraction on its hinges. She finished cleaning the kitchen. She went to bed. And on Friday, she walked to the creek again. She had been going to the creek every Friday for 2 years and 4 months by the time she arrived in Harlow Creek. The ritual had started the spring her younger brother Henry died. Henry had been 17. He had fallen through the ice of the Missouri River in February of 1882. Thin ice, late winter. The kind that fools you by holding for 3 steps before it doesn't. He had been trying to reach a sheep that had wandered onto the frozen edge, because that was the kind of person. Henry was the kind who ran toward the thing in trouble rather than away from it. They never recovered his body. That was the part that had lodged in Charlotte, the way a splinter lodges small, specific, and impossible to leave alone. She had buried an empty box in the churchyard in St. Joseph and tried to feel the closure of it, and she had felt nothing, nothing that counted. Because there was no body, the death had never quite become real to her in the way deaths become real. It lived inside her instead as an open wound, not raw anymore, not bleeding, but unhealed, unresolved. She had started walking to the nearest water every Friday because water was where he had gone, and water was the only place she felt close to him. She brought whatever she could find. Wildflowers in summer, dried stems in winter. Sometimes just a small stone, and she stood at the edge and let herself feel what she could not say. She had never told anyone. The people in St. Joseph had known Henry had known her, and still nobody had known what those Friday walks were. The family in Cheyenne had not asked. The men at Hargrove's boarding house had made comments about it, and she had let them assume what they wanted, that she was eccentric, that she was strange, that she was the kind of woman who walks alone because nobody wants to walk with her. It was easier than the truth. The truth was too big and too tender to hand to strangers. Chahe. The third Friday he followed her. Not close. Not with any intention she could have named if she had turned and seen him. He had told himself he was checking the fence line, which was true enough. There was a section of it that needed attention about a quarter-mile north. But when Charlotte passed the yard and began her walk down the slope, he took a direction that wasn't quite the fence line and wasn't quite away from her. He stopped about 100 yards back when he saw her reach the creek. He watched her place the flowers. He watched her stand there with her hands folded, looking at the water for nearly 5 full minutes. He had watched cattle die and horses, and one man his father, in a long and exhausting decline. He had stood at enough graves to know grief when he saw it, and what he was seeing in the slope of Charlotte Whitaker's shoulders was grief. Old grief. The kind that has made itself at home in a person's body. He turned and walked back to the fence line before she turned around. He fixed the fence section. He didn't say anything to her. The fourth Friday, the rain came. Not gentle summer rain, but a hard-driving Wyoming rain that rattled the windows and turned the yard to mud and made every sensible person in the county find somewhere dry to stand. Charlotte was up at 4, as always, bread in the oven, coffee on. By 6, the kitchen was fed. By 6:30, she had her canvas bag and her cloth bundle and her coat. Hector found her at the back door, dressed to go out in weather that was objectively miserable. "Miss Whitaker," he said carefully, "it's a hard rain." "I know. The creek'll be up." "I know." He studied her face. He was a man who had spent 20 years reading other people, reading the weather, reading animals, reading the particular brand of stubbornness that sometimes keeps a person alive and sometimes gets them killed. "You need me to walk with you?" he asked. The offer surprised her. She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "But thank you, Mr. Reyes." She went out into the rain. She made it to the fence line, then the slope, then the creek bank, which was up, as Hector had said, the water fast and gray-brown with runoff. She stood at the edge and looked at it, and took out her flowers, summer clover, half wilted already from the week on the shelf, and knelt at the bank and set them in the water. The current took them immediately. She watched them go. She was still watching when a voice came from behind her. "What are you looking for?" She startled, spun around. William Harrison stood 6 feet away in the rain, his hat pulled low, his coat dark with water. He was not angry. He was not curious in the intrusive way. He looked like a man who had asked the only question he had. Charlotte stared at him. Her first instinct was the instinct she always had: nothing. "I'm fine, don't concern yourself." The words were already forming, but something in the way he had asked it stopped her. Not softly, he hadn't asked it softly. He had asked it the way he spoke about everything, direct and without ornamentation, as if the question meant exactly what it was, and nothing more and nothing less. "What are you looking for?" She looked at the water where her flowers had already vanished. "My brother," she said. The word fell into the rain. Will Harrison didn't move. I didn't say "I'm sorry" the way people said it when they wanted the conversation to end. He didn't look away, didn't shift his weight, didn't reach for the first comfortable thing to say. He just stood in the rain with the question he had asked and the answer she had given, and let both of them exist. After a while he said, "He's gone. 2 years. She paused. "He fell through the river ice. They never found him." The rain came down. "So you come here," Will said, slowly, following the logic of it. "To the water." "Every Friday," she said. "Wherever I am." She looked at the creek. "I know it doesn't make sense." "It makes sense," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the gray eyes that she had been reading for 3 weeks now. The eyes of a man who did not say things he didn't mean, who did not offer comfort he wasn't prepared to stand behind. "It makes sense," he said again, quiet and certain. Standing in the rain on the bank of Harlow Creek, Charlotte. Whitaker felt something she had not felt in 2 years and 4 months. She felt witnessed, not pitied, not managed, not observed from a comfortable distance by someone who was relieved when the conversation moved on. She felt seen the way a person feels seen when someone stops what they are doing and actually looks. She swallowed. "I should get back," she said. "Lunch won't make itself." "No," Will agreed. "It won't." He walked with her back to the house. Not close enough to be forward, not far enough to be indifferent. Just with her. They didn't speak again until the yard. At the kitchen door he paused. "Miss Whitaker." She stopped. "Whatever you're looking for," he said. "You don't have to look alone." He walked on toward the barn. Charlotte stood at the kitchen door in the rain, with her empty cloth bundle and her wet coat, and something cracked open in her chest, and she pressed her hand flat against the doorframe and breathed. She breathed. Then she went inside and started on lunch, and she did not cry, and she did not stop thinking about what he had said for the rest of the day, or the next, or the one after that. The Monday after the rain changed something between them. Not loudly, not in any way that either of them would have named out loud. But Charlotte felt it the moment Will walked through the kitchen doorway that morning, and looked at her with eyes that had stopped pretending they hadn't seen what they'd seen. "I didn't say good morning." He never said good morning. That wasn't the kind of man he was. He just poured his coffee and stood at the counter for a moment longer than usual before he walked back out. And that extra beat of silence was in its own way more than most men had ever given her. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself that convincingly for about 4 days. The problem was that Will Harrison had an inconvenient habit of doing things that were impossible to file away under nothing. He was not a demonstrative man. I was not a man who leaned against doorways and made warm conversation or remembered small details to bring up later. And yet, and this was the part Charlotte kept running into when she tried to be sensible about it, he paid attention. Real attention. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Tuesday of that week, she mentioned in passing to Hector that the kitchen needed a better cutting block, that the existing one had a crack running through the grain that was going to split clean through within a month. She mentioned it once quietly while checking inventory, not as a complaint, but as a practical observation. Thursday morning, a new cutting block was on the kitchen table. No note. No mention of it at supper. Will didn't look at it when he walked through, didn't reference it. It was simply there, the way things are simply there when someone has listened without making a performance of listening. Charlotte ran her hand along the grain of the new wood and felt something uncomfortable move through her. She was not a woman who had ever made the mistake of reading too much into practical kindness. She had worked in enough houses to know that men who provided decent working conditions were not the same as men who cared. She knew the difference between an employer who respected his property, which included in the accounting of such things his hired staff, and a man who was moved by something more specific. She knew the difference. She was not sure standing at that kitchen counter with her hand on new wood which category applied here. She told herself it didn't matter either way and went back to work. What she could not so easily dismiss was what happened at the Friday market. Every 2 weeks, the town of Harlow Creek held a trading day. Ranchers and farmers and traveling merchants, setting up along the main street, selling and buying and negotiating in the particular language of people who live by what the land produces. Will sent Charlotte with Hector and the wagon on the second Friday of her employment to resupply the kitchen, which was still not fully stocked to her standards. She was examining dried beans at a merchant's table when she heard it start. A group of women. 3 of them, the kind who traveled in formation, had positioned themselves 10 feet away, near enough that Charlotte could feel the awareness of them without looking. She had developed a precise sensor for this over the years. The way certain people arranged themselves in space when they wanted to make a point without technically making it. "Doesn't she work for Harrison?" one of them said, not whispering, not quite. Another one, the sound coated in something sweet and rotten. I heard he couldn't find anyone else willing. Can you imagine? A pause waited with implication. Cooking for 12 men in that heat, though I suppose some women aren't built for delicacy. Laughter. Light, airy, the kind designed to sound careless when it isn't. Charlotte set down the bag of beans she was holding. She picked it back up. She set it down again. She breathed. She had a system for these moments, had developed it over years of necessity. You breathe. You do not look. You do not answer. You make your purchase, and you walk away with your spine straight, and your face even, and you save whatever is burning in your chest for somewhere private. She was reaching for her coin purse when a voice cut through the market noise like a blade through rope. Meredith, Will Harrison, had come to the market himself. Nobody had told Charlotte he was planning to. He was standing 6 feet from the group of women, and he was looking at the one who had spoken last, a tall, sandy-haired woman in a green dress who had gone still the way people go still when they realize they have miscalculated. Mr. Harrison, the woman said. I believe you were speaking about my cook, Will said. The woman opened her mouth. I'd like you to finish what you were saying, he said. Out loud. So we're all clear on it. Silence rolled out across the surrounding 10 feet of market like something physical. The woman in the green dress, Meredith, was not used to being put in this position. Charlotte could see it in the way her chin came up, the instinct to recover dignity, and then came back down again when she looked at Will Harrison's face. I know what you were doing. His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of something that doesn't need volume because it already has weight. Miss Whitaker runs my kitchen and my ranch operations better than anyone has in 3 years. I'd appreciate you keeping your opinions about her to yourself. Nobody said anything. Will looked at Charlotte. A brief look, checking rather than demanding. Are you all right? She was not particularly all right. Her heart was going at a pace she found inconvenient. But she picked up the bag of beans and put it in the basket and gave him a look back that she hoped communicated. We can speak about this later, more clearly than thank you so much. I cannot currently breathe. He turned and walked toward the feed merchant. Charlotte finished her purchasing. She could feel Meredith and her companions watching her as she moved through the market, and she could feel the difference. The subtle shift that happens in a crowd when someone has been named as belonging to someone who matters. She didn't like needing that. She had never liked needing that. But she was honest enough with herself to know that today, in this moment, she was grateful for it, and she folded that gratitude carefully and put it somewhere she could examine it later. Hector was loading the wagon when she reached it. He took one look at her face and said nothing, which was one of the things she had come to genuinely appreciate about him. He came to the market himself, she said, not quite a question. He sometimes does, Hector said. He came for a reason today. Hector adjusted a crate. He came because he wanted to, he said simply. Man does most things because he wants to. Charlotte got up on the wagon seat and looked at the middle distance and said nothing for the rest of the ride back. The thing about Will Harrison was that he didn't make it easy to categorize him. She had worked for men who were good employers because it was efficient. She had worked for men who were decent because they were afraid of God or law or reputation. She had not previously worked for a man who seemed to operate from something quieter and more personal, a private set of principles that he applied consistently and without fanfare, regardless of audience. That night at supper, she watched him interact with his hands. She did this sometimes not transparently, but in the practiced way of someone accustomed to gathering information from the periphery of things. She watched the way he spoke to the youngest hand, a boy of 16 named Caleb, who was still finding his confidence with the particular brand of direct encouragement that doesn't condescend. She watched the way he cut off briefly and firmly a conversation that was heading toward cruelty. She watched him be fair, and she thought about what fairness actually cost, and whether this man knew the price of it or just paid it automatically because it was the only currency he understood. She was still thinking about it when she heard the commotion from the bunkhouse. It started as raised voices, not unusual on a working ranch, but it escalated quickly enough that Charlotte put down her dishcloth and went to the doorway. Two of the hands were in a full argument in the yard, close enough to physical that the other men had created a rough circle around them. She could see Hector moving toward them from the barn. She was watching Hector handle the situation when she became aware that Will was no longer at the supper table. He was already in the yard. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stepped between the two men, literally stepped between them at a proximity that required real nerve. Since one of the men was flushed red and breathing hard and said something low and direct that Charlotte couldn't hear from the doorway. Whatever it was, it worked. The circle broke. The two men separated. The yard went back to its ordinary evening noise. Will turned back toward the house. He looked up and caught Charlotte standing in the kitchen doorway watching. She probably should have looked away. A well-trained employee, which she technically was, would have looked away and pretended to be busy. She didn't look away. Neither did he. After a moment she said, "Your supper's getting cold." "I'll be there directly," he said. He was. She served him his reheated plate without comment, and he ate it without comment, and it was the most ordinary exchange in the world, and she could not stop the quiet, inconvenient truth from settling in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. She liked him. She genuinely, specifically liked him. Not in the soft, unfocused way she might have liked anyone who treated her decently after years of not being treated decently. In the pointed, uncomfortable way she liked Henry, her brother, who had been the only other person in her life who paid attention without needing acknowledgement for it. She thought about Henry, and the stone in her chest sharpened into something that hurt, and she washed the dishes with more force than strictly necessary. The complication arrived on a Wednesday, 10 days after the market. Her name was Delia Marsh. Charlotte learned the name from Caleb, the youngest hand, who mentioned it with the careless information dropping of someone who doesn't know he is delivering something loaded. "Mr. Harrison used to be sweet on Delia Marsh," Caleb said while she was sharpening a kitchen knife, and he was supposed to be chopping vegetables, and was instead doing what 16-year-olds do, which is talk. Before she went to Denver, a lot of people figured they'd end up together. Charlotte sharpened the knife. "She's back," Caleb added, apparently feeling this fact needed emphasis. "Passed through town yesterday. Hector saw her." Charlotte looked at him. "Those carrots aren't going to cut themselves." He picked up the knife. She sharpened her own knife and thought about exactly nothing, which is to say, she thought about it with the sustained, careful attention of someone who has had a great deal of practice, not thinking about the things that matter most. Delia Marsh arrived at the ranch the following morning. Charlotte knew she had arrived because she heard the front door and then heard Will's voice in the parlor, which was unusual. He almost never used the parlor, the way men who live alone tend to let the formal rooms of a house atrophy to decorative storage. But the parlor was where he took her, and Charlotte kept the kitchen door open only as much as the cooking required, which was entirely coincidental, and she told herself this firmly. Delia Marsh had a voice that carried. Low, but with a particular timbre of someone accustomed to being listened to. Charlotte caught fragments 5 years, and Denver wasn't what I expected, and something that might have been, I made a mistake. What she could not hear was Will's voice, which was lower and less carrying, and she could only measure the conversation by its pauses. The pauses were long. After 40 minutes, Delia left. Charlotte heard the front door, and then the sound of a horse moving away down the road, and then nothing. Will didn't appear at lunch. He appeared at supper, looking like a man who had spent the afternoon somewhere difficult inside himself, and he ate without speaking to anyone, and the hands were sensitive enough to the weather of him to keep their own conversation small. Charlotte set his plate down and refilled his coffee and went back to the kitchen. She was cleaning up when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You heard," he said, not a question. She looked up from the pot. "I wasn't listening." "You heard enough," he said, and it wasn't an accusation, just a fact, stated cleanly. She set the pot down. "It's not my business, Mr. Harrison." "No," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands the first time she had ever seen him do that. Some restless working of his fingers that looked out of place on a man so generally still. "She wants to come back." Charlotte looked at him. "To Harlow Creek." "To the ranch." He paused. to circumstances she left behind. The kitchen was very quiet. "What did you tell her?" Charlotte asked. He looked at her directly, the gray eyes and the habit of saying things plain. "I told her I needed to think." She nodded. She picked the pot back up. "Miss Whitaker." She stopped. "You have an opinion," he said. "I can see it. I'd rather you said it than didn't." She turned around slowly. She looked at him the way he was standing, the hat in his hands, the expression of a man who was asking something real, not something polite. "It's not my place," she said again. "I'm making it your place," he said. "Tell me what you think." She set the pot down for the second time. "I think," she said carefully, "that a woman who left a good man and a good ranch for something better, and then came back when the better thing didn't work out, is not a woman who has changed. She's a woman who has run out of better options." She met his eyes. "And I think you know the difference between being chosen and being settled for." The words landed. She could see them land. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he looked down at the hat in his hands and made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same neighborhood. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I do know that." He put his hat back on. "Good night, Miss Whitaker." "Good night, Mr. Harrison." He walked out. She stood in the kitchen for a full minute before she picked up the pot again, and her hands were entirely steady, which she considered a personal achievement. She was not naive enough to think that what she had said, or the fact that she'd said it, meant anything conclusive. Men did not always choose wisdom over familiarity. Men did not always, when standing at a crossroads, take the road that made the better sense. She had watched enough of the world to know that what people deserved and what they got were frequently unacquainted with each other. But she had said the thing, and he had heard it, and that was enough for tonight. What was not enough? What kept her awake later? Lying in the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen that was hers for now was a conversation she had not expected and could not shake. She had stepped outside for air after the kitchen was clean, standing in the cool of the evening away from the lamplight when she heard two of the hands talking near the bunkhouse wall. They weren't speaking to her and weren't aware of her, and she should have gone back inside the moment she realized she was overhearing something. She didn't. "Harrison's going to take Delia back," the first voice said. "You watch." "You think so?" "Man's been alone too long. He'll do what's comfortable." A pause. Then the second voice lower. "What about the cook? She's smart. She's good." "She's good at the work." The first voice flatter, now carrying the particular weight of a casually cruel thing about to be said simply because it can be. But men like Harrison don't end up with women like that. Not for keeps. Charlotte went inside. She lay in the dark, and she did not argue with the voice in her head that said, "He's right," because arguing with true things is a waste of energy. And she was very tired, and she had learned at considerable cost not to waste energy on things she could not change. She was not the kind of woman men like Will Harrison ended up with. She knew this. She had always known this. Knowing it and feeling it had always been two separate experiences, and tonight, for some reason, she was not going to examine too closely. The feeling was considerably more specific and more located in her chest than usual. She breathed through it. She thought of Henry, the way she always thought of Henry when she needed to locate herself in time and continuity. "You are still here," she told herself the way she sometimes had to. "That's not nothing." She slept. What she woke to was noise. It was before 4 in the morning. She could tell by the depth of the dark outside her window and the quality of the silence that means everyone who should be sleeping is sleeping. But someone wasn't sleeping, and whatever they were doing was doing it loudly enough to pull her out of unconsciousness. She was dressed in 2 minutes. She had always been quick at that, quick and practical about the things that mattered. She went out the kitchen door and followed the noise to the near paddock. 3 horses were loose. They'd broken through a section of fencing that had apparently been weakened already. She'd noticed it last week and mentioned it to Hector, who had said he'd get to it and apparently hadn't gotten to it yet. The horses were not badly spooked, just loose and taking advantage of it, moving in the agitated half-circles that horses do when they're neither fully alarmed nor fully calm. Charlotte assessed the situation in about 4 seconds. She went back to the barn, found the rope she needed, and came back out. Horses were something she understood in a way that she couldn't entirely explain and had long since stopped trying to. It had started with her father's mill horse when she was 6 and just never stopped. She understood the language of them not mystically, but practically, the way you understand any language you've spent your life inside. She understood what they were afraid of, and what they responded to, and what they needed. She went into the paddock, and she moved quietly without haste, making herself small in the way you make yourself small. Not by crouching, but by letting your energy settle, and she started with the least agitated horse first. She had 2 of them secured, and the third almost in hand, when she heard boots on the ground behind her. "Miss Whitaker." Will's voice. He'd come from the house, she could tell from the direction. "I've got the third one," she said without turning. "Give me a minute." She gave herself the minute and got the third horse secure. Then she turned. Will was standing at the paddock fence, still in his shirt and braces, which told her he'd dressed as quickly as she had, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not surprise exactly, she had stopped surprising him at the water trough weeks ago. Something more complicated than surprise. Something that took in the rope in her hands, and the 3 secured horses, and her face in the early dark, and was doing some kind of accounting. "You were going to get Hector," she said. "I was," he agreed. "And then I saw you already in the paddock." She started moving toward the fence line, planning to check the break. He fell into step on the other side. "That fencing's been soft for 3 weeks, she said. "You mentioned it to Hector. He mentioned he'd fix it. I'll speak to him in the morning." She found the break and looked at it, and then looked at him through the fence, which was an angle that required her to look up, which she generally tried not to be in the position of doing. "I can repair this temporarily tonight, properly in the morning." He studied her face for a moment. Then, almost as if the question was coming from somewhere he hadn't planned, "How do you know all of it? The horses, the cattle, the water. How does one person know all of it?" She considered lying not dishonestly, but with the polite evasion she generally deployed when people asked questions that required real answers. She was tired, and it was 4 in the morning, and her defenses were operating at reduced capacity. "My father taught me everything he knew," she said. "And when he died, I kept learning because there was no one to do it for me if I didn't." She pulled the fence wire taut. "You learn a lot when your options are learn or don't survive." Silence. Then, "How old were you when he died?" 16. The word sat between them in the dark. He didn't say "I'm sorry." She had noticed this about him, that he didn't reflexively produce the phrase the way most people did, as a way of closing a subject, rather than engaging with it. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had a different quality than the polite kind. "You've been managing on your own since 16, he said. "Yes." "That's—" He stopped. "It's just what happened," she said. Not dismissive, just accurate. He was still looking at her through the fence with that complicated expression, and she was looking back at him, and it was 4 in the morning, and they were both in their working clothes, and there were 3 horses behind her, and a broken fence between them, and Charlotte thought this is actually happening, though she could not have said exactly what this referred to. "Go inside," she said finally. "I'll finish this. I'll stay." "Mr. Harrison." "Will," he said. She stopped. "You've been working in my house for 5 weeks, he said. "I think we're past Mr. Harrison." She looked at him. He looked back. The situation had taken on a quality she recognized as one of those moments that either becomes something or doesn't, and she had enough experience with this particular fork in the road to know that what happened in the next few seconds mattered more than either of them was going to acknowledge out loud. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. She turned back to the fence. He stayed. They worked in silence for the better part of 20 minutes, and she was acutely aware the entire time of the specific quality of working alongside someone who was actually useful. Not in the way people are useful when they're trying to help, and mostly getting in the way, but in the competent, unshowy way of someone who knows what needs to be done and does it. By the time the fence was secured enough to hold until morning, the first gray light was showing at the edge of the sky. "I need to start the bread," she said. "Right." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he said very quietly, so quietly she almost wasn't sure she'd heard it. "Charlotte." Her first name, in his voice. At 5 in the morning, with the sky going gray above them. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. "For the horses, for the fence, for—" He paused, and she had the impression of a man choosing his next word with the care of someone who knows that words mean things. "For staying," she breathed. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and meant it as plainly as he would have meant it, and hoped he heard that, and turned and walked back to the house before she said anything else, because she had reached the limit of what she could manage in one 4 in the morning conversation, and the bread genuinely did need starting, and some things were better left in the gray light where they had happened, rather than brought inside and examined. But she had meant it. She was not going anywhere, and somewhere between the horses and the fence, and the first light breaking, she stopped pretending she didn't know exactly what that meant. The bread was on the table by 6, as it always was, and nobody knew what had happened at 5 in the morning, except the horses and the fence and the gray sky, and Charlotte intended to keep it that way. She moved through the morning with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to let work be its own kind of armor. Breakfast for 12 coffee, kept hot the kitchen, a controlled operation that required enough of her attention to prevent other kinds of thinking. She was good at this. She had been good at it for years. The work asked for her hands and her focus, and gave back order and purpose, and order and purpose were things she trusted more than most things she could name. Will came in at 7. With the other men sat at his end of the table, and did not look at her differently than he had the morning before. This was either a relief or a disappointment, and she refused to decide which. What she noticed was that he ate 2 servings of the biscuits. He had never done that before. She noticed it. She did not allow herself to do anything with it. She refilled coffee cups and kept moving. Hector found her after breakfast when the kitchen was empty. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, a posture she had come to associate with him, preparing to say something he'd considered carefully, and he looked at the patched fence line through the window, and then looked at her. "Will told me about the horses," he said. "The fencing needed attention. I mentioned it 3 weeks ago." "You did," he said. "That's on me. I'm sorry, Miss Whitaker." She was surprised enough by the directness of it that she stopped what she was doing and looked at him properly. Hector Reyes did not traffic in excuses. She had learned this about him inside the first week. He made mistakes, and he owned them the same way he owned everything else, plainly, without theater. "It's done now," she said. "It is." He paused. "Charlotte." It was the first time he had used her given name. Not forward, it landed as something deliberate, a marker of a category change. "You should know that what you did this morning, not just the fence, but all of it since you got here, it matters. The men see it. The ranch sees it." A pause. "Will sees it." She looked at the counter. "I'm just doing my job," she said. "No," Hector said quietly. "You're doing considerably more than that. And there's a difference, and you know it, and so does everyone else." He put his hat back on. "I thought someone ought to say so." He left. Charlotte stood in this kitchen for a moment, her hands flat on the counter, and breathed through the uncomfortable warmth of being seen accurately by someone who had no reason to manage her feelings about it. Then she got on with the day. The day did not stay manageable for long. At 11:30 a rider came in from the South Road. Not one of the Harrison hands, but a man she hadn't seen before, dusty and riding fast, who went directly to the barn where Will and Hector were working. Charlotte was in the yard hanging the kitchen linens when he arrived. She watched him the way she watched most things, with the periphery of her attention. The rider was inside the barn for 20 minutes. When he came out, he rode back the way he came without stopping. Will came out of the barn with a face that told her something had changed. She had learned to read his face the way she read water and weather, not dramatically. Nothing. He broadcast, but in the small muscular adjustments of a person who is processing something significant. He looked across the yard and found her. "Come inside," he said. "Both of you," this to Hector, who had followed him out. They sat at the kitchen table, which was the room Will used for real conversations, rather than the parlor which she had come to understand was the room for company, and the kitchen was the room for truth. "Platt is moving on the south pasture," Will said. Hector's jaw tightened. He filed, "Worse. He's already got men on the disputed line. claims the creek boundary was misdrawn when my father filed the original deed, and that the south pasture water rights belong to his property under territorial law. The creek. Charlotte's hands stilled on the table. He's not wrong about the water law, Hector said slowly. If the original survey was off, I know. Will's voice was controlled, but she could hear what was under the control. If Platt takes the water rights, the south pasture is worthless. I lose 30% of my viable grazing. The cattle operation doesn't survive on what's left. Silence. What does the deed say? Charlotte asked. Both men looked at her. Not with the look of men surprised a woman had spoken, but the look of men who had forgotten for a moment that a third person was in the room. The deed references the creek as the eastern boundary, Will said. But the original survey description is unclear. It was done in '69. The surveyor who did it has been dead for 8 years. The survey stakes, Charlotte said. Are they still in the ground? Will looked at her. Some of them. The stakes would have been set before the deed was written. If Platt's claim is that the boundary was misdrawn in the deed, the original stakes predate the deed and would show what the surveyor actually measured. She kept her voice even. Has anyone walked the original stake line? The two men looked at each other. No, Will said. Then that's where you start, Charlotte said. Not with lawyers. With the ground. Will stared at her. My father spent 3 years fighting a mill boundary dispute, she said. He lost because he started with the law and ended with the ground. He should have done it the other way. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Hector made a sound, not a laugh, something quieter, and looked at Will with an expression that said something Charlotte didn't have the full context to read. Will was still looking at her. You'd know what you were looking for. Survey stakes from the '60s were set in red cedar 2 feet deep with a blaze cut on the north face. If they're in the ground, they're findable. She paused. If the line holds, Platt has nothing. If it doesn't hold, you know before he does, which gives you options. Will leaned back. He was thinking she could tell by the particular stillness that came over him when he was actually processing something different from the general stillness of his manner, more interior. "Then you ride?" he asked. "Well enough." "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Early." It was not a question. She nodded. Hector pulled the deed from the ranch safe that afternoon. Charlotte spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with it. With a surveyor's terminology guide she found in the ranch's small office bookshelf, tracing what the language was actually describing versus what Platt was claiming the language meant. Will sat across from her for part of it, not interfering, watching her work with the focused attention she had come to recognize as one of his most consistent qualities. "You read land surveys," he said at one point. "Less a statement than a private reckoning." "I read what I need to read," she said without looking up. "Sit still, you're making me lose my count." He sat still. She heard one of the hands pass the kitchen window and make a low remark to another. She caught the words, "a woman and survey deed," and then Hector's voice from somewhere outside, brief and final, and then nothing more. By evening, she had a reasonable picture of what the original stakes should show if they were still in place. She wrote it out on a piece of paper and put it in her coat pocket. She did not sleep particularly well. It wasn't the Platt situation that kept her awake, or not only that. It was the consciousness of what was building not just between her and Will, but in the structure of her position here, which had shifted considerably from cook and was now something else she didn't have an accurate word for. Something that mattered. Something she could lose. She had lost things that mattered before. She knew exactly how that felt, not just the acute part, the moment of it, but the long aftermath of carrying around the shape of something that used to be there. She had been carrying Henry's shape for 2 years and 4 months. She was not eager to add another. At 4:30, she got up and started the bread, and told herself she was a practical woman who dealt in practical realities, and the practical reality was that tomorrow there were survey stakes to find, and after that there would be other things, and she would deal with each of them as they came. They rode out at first light, just the two of them. Hector had offered to come. Will had said no without explaining why, and Charlotte had not asked, and Hector had looked at them both with the expression of a man who understands more than he is required to comment on. The south pasture boundary line stretched nearly 3 miles, and they rode it in the cool of the early morning with Charlotte referencing the notes in her pocket, and Will knowing the land in the bodily way of someone who has ridden it since childhood. They didn't talk much. The horses moved and the ground moved under them, and the silence was the easy kind, the kind that doesn't require filling. She found the first stake 40 minutes in. It was half buried, the cedar weathered gray, but solid. The north face blaze still legible, if you knew what to look for. She dismounted before Will had finished asking her what she'd seen and crouched beside it with her notes. "This is the original eastern corner," she said. "Look at the bearing." She showed him the survey description. "Platt's claim puts his boundary here, but this stake is 15 feet east of where he says the line falls." Will crouched beside her. He looked at the stake and the notes, and then at the land around them with the expression of a man doing geometry in his head. "If this stake is right," he started. "We need 3 more to be certain," she said. "But if they all read consistent, Platt's claim doesn't hold." They found the second stake, then the third. Both consistent. Both placing the boundary east of Platt's claimed line by distances that varied but averaged 15 feet, enough to put the water rights clearly on Harrison land. The fourth stake was gone. Not buried, gone. The ground around where it should have been was disturbed. Recently disturbed. Charlotte and Will stood looking at it. "Someone pulled it," she said. Will's face had gone very still. "When?" he said. "Ground's dry but not crusted over at the disturbed area. Within the last week." She looked at him. "Platt. He can't file a legal claim based on falsified survey evidence. He can if no one knows the stake was ever there." Her voice was even. "He files his claim, the boundary dispute goes to a territorial judge. There are 3 stakes on his side of the argument, and 3 on yours, but one of yours is missing. A judge who doesn't know this land and doesn't have original field notes is going to have difficulty deciding." She paused. "He's not trying to win legally. He's trying to make it expensive enough that you settle." Will looked at the empty ground where the stake should have been for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you draw it?" "Draw what?" "The stake line. What the original survey shows from the 3 we found extrapolated to where the 4th should be. Something a lawyer can put in front of a judge." She looked at him. "I'm a cook, Will. You're a woman who just read a 60-year-old survey deed in an afternoon and located 3 buried stakes on a 3-mile boundary line." He looked back at her steadily. "Can you draw it?" It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "Then that's what we do." They rode back. And it was on the ride back that it happened, the thing that Charlotte had not planned for, and could not afterward pretend hadn't meant what it meant. They were moving at an easy pace, side by side, and the morning had warmed enough that the earlier chill was gone, and Will had been quiet for a while in the interior way. That meant he was thinking rather than absent, and then he said without preamble, "Tell me about Henry." She looked at him. He looked forward at the space between his horse's ears. "You don't have to," he said, "but I'd like to know, if you're willing." She was quiet for so long that he glanced at her, checking, and she looked at the space between her own horse's ears and thought about what it costs to say a true thing out loud to another person. Not the words were available while she had the words, but the act of saying them. The way saying something real to someone real makes it more real in a way that can't be undone. He was 17, she said, and then she told him. All of it. The ice, the sheep. The way Henry had always been the kind of person who ran toward the trouble instead of away from it. The empty box in the churchyard, the 2 years and 4 months of Friday mornings at whatever water was nearest, because water was the only place she felt close to him. She did not look at Will while she talked. She looked at the land they were riding through. She kept her voice even. When she finished, the silence lasted a while. "He sounds like someone worth missing," Will said finally. She breathed. "He was," she said. Another silence. Then, "I had a brother too, younger. Fever took him when he was 8. He paused. "I still reach for him sometimes, 23 years later. I'll think Thomas would find this funny, and then I remember." He was quiet. "It doesn't stop." "No," Charlotte said. "It doesn't." They rode. The strange and unexpected thing was not the sadness of what they had said, but the quality of the air between them afterward, which was lighter rather than heavier. As if saying true things, even hard ones, cleared some atmospheric pressure that had been building without either of them naming it. She thought this is what it would be like, to have a person to say true things to. She did not let herself follow that thought far. But she did not stop it immediately either. They arrived back at the ranch to find Victoria Caldwell's horse at the post. Charlotte felt Will's energy change the moment he saw it, a subtle tightening. Not anger, but the particular bracing of a man who knows he is about to manage something he does not particularly want to manage. "Stay," he said to Charlotte quietly before they'd fully dismounted. "Not a command, a request. Whatever she says in there." Charlotte looked at him. "She came with a purpose," he said. "And I'd like you to hear it, so I have a witness who'll tell me afterward whether my read of it was right." That was an unusual thing to ask a person, a vulnerable thing under the practicality of it. She felt the weight of it. "All right," she said. Victoria was in the parlor, which she had apparently let herself into, with the confidence of a woman who had done it before and expected to continue doing it. She was dressed well as always, the kind of carefully composed appearance that announces both wealth and effort. And when Charlotte walked in behind Will, something moved in Victoria's face that she controlled quickly. "Will," she said warmly. And then cooler, the calibrated kind of cool, "Miss Whitaker." "Victoria," Will said. "What brings you out?" "I heard about the Platt business." She arranged her skirts. "I wanted you to know that I'm prepared to help." "Help how?" "The Caldwell property has senior water rights on the Eastern Creek branch. If you're dealing with a boundary dispute, a formal agreement between our properties regarding water access would strengthen your claim considerably." She paused, letting this land. "I'm prepared to offer that agreement." Will was still. "What kind of agreement?" Victoria smiled. It was a practiced smile, not dishonest, but shaped. "The kind that benefits both properties." Another pause. "I think we both know what I'm suggesting, Will. Our families have been neighbors for 30 years. A formal joining of the properties would resolve your boundary issue, strengthen both our positions against territorial encroachment, and," she let the sentence curve, "provide us both with something we've been without for too long." The parlor was very quiet. Charlotte looked at her hands. Will said, "You're proposing marriage." "I'm proposing a mutually advantageous arrangement," Victoria said with the precision of a woman who has learned to package things correctly, "which could become whatever we chose to make it." Will looked at her for a long moment. Charlotte could see his profile from where she stood, the set of his jaw, the particular stillness. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "I'll think on it." Victoria's composure held perfectly. She rose, gathered herself, and smiled again this time, with something underneath it that was sharper. "Don't think too long," she said. "The offer has a natural season like everything else." She left. The parlor held her absence for a moment. Then Will turned. He looked at Charlotte with an expression she had not seen on him before, not quite asking, not quite telling. Something in between. Something that required her to be honest with him in a way she was not entirely prepared for. "You're for your rid," he said. She breathed. "She doesn't love you," Charlotte said. "She loves what you have. The property, the position. The water rights business is real. She's right that it would help you, but it's also convenient. She is proposing a transaction and calling it something else, because that's the language she knows." She paused. "And she knew I was in the room. She made her offer in front of me deliberately." "Why?" Charlotte looked at him. "Because she wanted you to see how I'd react," she said. She was taking a measurement. Will looked at her steadily. "And," he said. The word was quiet. Single. It held more inside it than a single word had any business holding, and they both knew it. Charlotte looked at the floor, looked back up. "And you should make whatever decision is right for the ranch," she said, and her voice was even, and she was proud of how even it was, and she hated how even it was. "That's not my business to weigh in on." "I asked you to witness," he said. "That means I want the full account." She held his gaze. "Then the full account," she said carefully, is that I think you deserve someone who wants you, not your water rights, not your land." She stopped. "I think you know what that looks like and what it doesn't, and I think Victoria Caldwell, for all her qualities, does not look like that." She breathed. "That's my read." The silence was the longest kind. Will looked at her for a moment that stretched past comfort into something else, something that had weight and temperature. And then he said very quietly, "Yeah." That was all. Yeah. But the way he said it made her feel like the floor had shifted 2 inches, not dangerously, but enough to notice. She excused herself back to the kitchen. She had bread dough that had been rising for 3 hours and genuinely needed attention, and she was going to give it her complete attention, and she was absolutely not going to think about the look on his face when he said, "Yeah," or the way it had landed in her chest, like something finding its address. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. She was shaping the second loaf when Caleb came skidding through the kitchen door with the stumbling urgency of someone who has been running. "Miss Whitaker." He was breathing hard. "There's men at the south fence." She put the bread down. "Platt's men." "I think so. 3 of them. Hector went out, but he sent me for Will." "Where's Will?" "Barn. I'm going." "Go," she said. He went. She wiped her hands, pulled off her apron, and went out the back. She didn't run. Running in a tense situation rarely helped anything, and arriving composed was usually worth more than arriving fast. But she moved quickly, and by the time she reached the south fence line, Will and Hector were already there, and across the line stood 3 men she didn't recognize, and between them and the missing stake location stood another man. She didn't recognize, better dressed than the others, with the particular posture of someone accustomed to winning small confrontations. Platt. She had not seen him before. He was perhaps 50 heavier than Will, with the look of a man who had built his confidence on the right combination of money and the absence of being challenged. He was talking when she arrived. Something about the boundary and the territorial office and legal process. The kind of language that is technically precise and practically designed to overwhelm. Will was listening without expression. Charlotte came and stood beside Hector, slightly behind Will's right shoulder. She did not speak. Platt noticed her. His gaze moved over her with the brief dismissive inventory of a man who has already placed her in a category. Cook. Not relevant. He continued talking. And then Charlotte did something she almost never did in a confrontation between men. She spoke. "Mr. Platt," she said. The men looked at her. Platt looked at her. Will turned his head slightly. "I was on this fence line this morning," she said. "I found 3 of the original survey stakes. I also found the disturbed ground where the 4th one was removed." She kept her voice clear and factual. "I've drawn the line from the 3 existing stakes extrapolated to the 4th position. It places the eastern boundary 15 feet east of where you're claiming the line falls." She paused. "The drawing is back at the house. I'd be glad to show you, or I can show a territorial judge, whichever you prefer." Platt looked at her. Then he looked at Will. Will said nothing. He just looked at Platt with the gray eyes and the particular stillness, and let Charlotte's words sit in the air between them. Platt's composure shifted. Not visibly, not in any way the other men around him could have named exactly, but Charlotte saw it the recalibration of a man who has walked into a room expecting emptiness and found furniture. "I don't know what you think you found," he said. "I know what I found," she said. "And I know what's not there that should be." She held his gaze. "You pulled the 4th stake, Mr. Platt. The ground says so. Now I have 3 stakes, a drawn survey line, and a very clear picture of exactly what case a judge would be evaluating." A pause. "What do you have?" Platt looked at her, looked at Will. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Will agreed, speaking for the first time. "But it's done for today. Get your men off my fence line." Platt stood for a moment, the moment of a man deciding whether to escalate or withdraw, weighing the calculation, making the choice. He turned. His men followed. Charlotte watched them go. When they were gone, Hector let out a long breath. One of the younger hands said something under his breath that she pretended not to hear. Will turned around. He looked at Charlotte for a long moment. She could feel every eye on the fence line on her, waiting to take the measure of the moment. The drawing, he said. "Is it accurate enough to file?" "It will be by tonight," she said. He nodded once. "Good," he said. He walked back toward the barn, and Hector fell into step beside him, and the hands dispersed, and Charlotte stood at the fence line for a moment by herself in the heat of the afternoon, with the strange, still clarity of someone who has just done a thing that cannot be undone. She had not stood in front of a man like Platt and held her ground since her father's mill. She had spent 6 years learning to be quiet and efficient and unobtrusive, because those were the qualities that kept a woman employed and safe and unremarkable was what she had needed to be. She was not feeling particularly unremarkable right now. She walked back to the house. She finished the bread. She drew the survey line carefully and accurately, referencing her morning notes, and she did not stop for supper until it was done to a standard she was satisfied with. Then she ate standing at the kitchen counter, because the men had already cleared the table, and she thought about what had happened at the fence line and what would come next. What came next arrived, not at midnight or in a dramatic hour, but at 8:30 in the evening, when the house had gone quiet, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with the finished survey drawing in front of her, checking it a final time. Will came into the kitchen. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the drawing for a moment, then looked at her. "I sent word to Delia this afternoon," he said. Charlotte went still. "I told her," he said, "that I wished her well, and that I had given her question the consideration it deserved, and the answer was no." The kitchen was very quiet. "And this morning," he said, "I told Hector to send Victoria a note thanking her for her proposal and declining." He paused. "I thought you should know." Charlotte looked at the survey drawing. She could feel her heartbeat in a way that was difficult to ignore. She was a practical woman. She dealt in facts and ground and what the survey stakes actually showed. She was not a woman who let her heart run ahead of her evidence. "Why are you telling me?" she asked. He looked at her with the gray eyes that did not lie and did not embellish and did not look away when they had something to say. "Because you were honest with me," he said. "About Delia, about Victoria, about Henry, about everything." He put his hands flat on the table. "And because I am not a man who is comfortable with debts, and I owe you the same honesty back," she breathed. "Will, I'm not asking you anything tonight," he said, quiet and clear. "I just wanted you to know where I stood, so you weren't in the dark about it." He paused. "You deserve to know where things stand. You've spent enough time working in places where nobody told you the truth about anything." The drawing blurred slightly. She blinked. She pressed her hand flat on the table and looked at it. "All right," she said. Her voice was almost steady. "All right," he said. He stood up. He looked at the drawing one more time. "That's good work," he said. "The survey line, it's going to hold up." "I know," she said. He almost smiled. She had learned to recognize it, the way the corner of his mouth moved before he stopped it, and the way he didn't always stop it. "Good night, Charlotte." "Good night, Will." He left. She sat at the kitchen table with the survey drawing in front of her, and her hands flat, and her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. And she thought about survey stakes and water rights, and a man who had looked at her and told her the truth, because she deserved to know where things stood. And she thought about Henry, who had always said that the only people worth keeping in your life were the ones who told you the truth, even when it would have been easier not to. She folded the survey drawing carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. She went to bed. Friday was coming. She would go to the creek again, as she always did. But for the first time in 2 years and 4 months, she thought that maybe Henry, wherever he was, would be glad about how things were going. He had always been the kind of person who was glad about the right things. She missed that about him. She missed all of it. But tonight, in the specific quiet of the Harrison Ranch kitchen, with the survey drawing in her coat and the truth spoken plainly between two people who meant it, she felt something she recognized from before Henry died, something she had thought might be gone permanently. She felt against all reasonable expectation, like she might be all right. The survey drawing went to the Territorial Land Office on a Monday morning, carried by Hector, on the fastest horse the ranch had, with a letter from Will, and a copy of Charlotte's stake documentation attached. By Wednesday, The land office had sent a reply acknowledging receipt and confirming that a formal review would be opened. By Thursday, word had reached Platt. Charlotte knew it had reached Platt because Caleb came in for lunch with the particular energized expression of someone carrying information. He considers important, and he set it down on the kitchen table, along with his hat, before he'd even pulled out his chair. Platt rode into town this morning, Caleb said. Went straight to the lawyer's office. Came out looking like he'd bitten something sour. Charlotte put the stew pot on the table. Eat, she said. You're not curious. I'm curious, she said. Eat first. Caleb ate. Then he said, his lawyer told him the documentation was solid. That's what Tommy Reese heard standing outside the window. Not on purpose. He was just passing, and Tommy told Pete, and Pete told me. Charlotte sat down across from him. What else did Tommy Reese hear not on purpose? Caleb grinned. Platt asked if there was any way to challenge the survey drawing. Lawyer said not without the original field notes from the '69 survey. He paused for effect in the way of someone who has been waiting to deliver the best part, which apparently exist in the Territorial Archive in Cheyenne. Charlotte went still. Hector already knows, Caleb said. He told Will an hour ago. She stood up and went back to the stove. The field notes. She had not known the field notes existed, had assumed, as most people assumed about 60-year-old government surveys, that the original documentation had been lost or destroyed or never properly filed. If the field notes were in Cheyenne, and if they matched what the stakes showed, the case became unassailable. And if they didn't match, if the surveyor's own notes contradicted the stake positions, then everything she had drawn was in question. She was thinking about this, working it through with the systematic focus she brought to every problem that mattered when Will appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. You heard, he said. Caleb talks, she said. I'm writing to Cheyenne. She turned from the stove. When? Tomorrow morning. I need those field notes before Platt gets his own lawyer to the archive. He paused. It's a 3-day ride there and back. I'll be gone 6 days minimum. The kitchen settled into a different kind of quiet. 6 days was a long time. Not in the abstract. 6 days was nothing. She had gone longer stretches without reliable company, her entire adult life. But 6 days in the specific context of what had been building between them felt like a significant distance. She was not going to say that. All right, she said. I'll keep the kitchen running. I know you will. He was still looking at her with the directness that she had stopped trying to deflect. Charlotte. She looked at him. When I get back, he said, and then paused, and she could see him choosing the words with the care he brought to things that mattered. I want to have a conversation. About the field notes. No. He held her gaze. Not about the field notes. The stove ticked. Somewhere outside, one of the horses moved. All right, she said for the second time, and her voice was entirely steady, and it cost her considerably more than it should have. He left the next morning before she had the bread in the oven. She heard the horse go and kept working, and told herself firmly that this was exactly what it was, a business trip and a legal matter, and nothing more and nothing less, and proceeded to run the kitchen and the ranch operations with the efficiency that had become her default mode when her feelings were in a state she declined to examine. What she did not expect was how the absence of him changed the texture of the days. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody could have looked at Charlotte Whitaker in those 6 days and identified anything specific. She did her work. She managed the kitchen. She advised Hector on the 2 cattle that were showing early signs of the same creek water sickness they'd dealt with before, and she was right about the cause and the treatment, and the cattle recovered. She fixed a problem with the bread oven's damper that had been causing uneven heat. She managed Caleb's tendency to take on tasks beyond his current competence, and she did it without embarrassing him, which she considered a particular skill. She did all of it. But in the evenings when the kitchen was clean and the house was quiet, she sat at the table and felt the 6-day shape of his absence, the way you feel a missing tooth, not constantly, not with overwhelming pain, but with the persistent specific awareness of a space that used to be occupied. She had not let herself think about a person that way in a very long time. She was not entirely sure she had ever let herself think about a person that way. Not in this particular form, which was quieter and more settled than anything she had previously experienced, and therefore more dangerous. On the third evening, Victoria Caldwell came to the ranch. Charlotte had not expected it. Will was gone, which meant the social logic of a visit from Victoria didn't quite add up, and the hour was later than visiting hours properly allowed. Hector answered the front door and came to find Charlotte in the kitchen with the careful expression of a man delivering news he has not personally ordered. "She's asking to speak with you," he said. Charlotte looked at him. "Not Will," Hector confirmed. "You." Charlotte took off her apron and went to the front room. Victoria Caldwell stood in the center of it with her composure intact and her purpose evident. She looked at Charlotte the way she always looked at Charlotte, with an assessment that covered the ground between them comprehensively, and then she sat down without being invited to, which told Charlotte a great deal about the nature of the visit. "He's in Cheyenne," Victoria said. "Yes." "For the Platte business?" "Yes." Victoria folded her hands in her lap. "You drew the survey documentation." "I did." A pause. "You're more than a cook," Victoria said. It was not a compliment, and it was not a criticism. It was a recalibration stated plainly by a woman who was, whatever else, she was not a fool. "I do what the situation requires," Charlotte said. Victoria looked at her for a moment. Then she said with the directness of someone who has decided that the social conventions are no longer serving their purpose. "He declined my proposal." "I know." "He told you?" "He told me he had declined it. He didn't discuss your business beyond that." Victoria nodded slowly. She looked at the floor, then back up, and there was something in her expression that Charlotte had not seen there before, a crack in the composure, not wide, but real. "I have managed this property alone for 7 years, Victoria said. "Since Robert died. 7 years of decisions and negotiations, and men who don't take you seriously until you've outmaneuvered them twice." She paused. "I am not Miss Whitaker. I am a woman who has been practical because practicality is what has kept me standing." Charlotte looked at her. "I know," she said quietly. Victoria's chin came up. "I'm not here to apologize. I didn't expect you were. I'm here because—" She stopped. Rearranged something in herself the way a person rearranges furniture before company comes. "I'm here because I want you to understand that what I said at that market was not about you. It was about my own fear." She said the word like it cost her. "And I am not in the habit of letting fear make my decisions without naming it." The room was quiet. Charlotte breathed. "Thank you for saying that," she said. Victoria looked at her, a long, evaluating look, but not hostile. Something more complicated. "You're going to make him happy," she said. "I don't know whether I find that comforting or inconvenient." "Probably both," Charlotte said. Something moved in Victoria's face that was almost a smile. She stood up. She pulled on her gloves. She looked at Charlotte one final time. "Don't let anyone make you small," she said. "You weren't built for it." She left. Charlotte stood in the front room alone and breathed through the strange sensation of having been seen accurately by the last person she would have expected. And then she went back to the kitchen and finished the evening work and allowed herself just for a moment to feel the specific and unfamiliar warmth of a thing that had gone differently than she'd expected. Will returned on the 6th day, which was a Thursday. She knew he was back before she heard the horse because the energy of the house changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way she could have described to someone who hadn't been paying the same kind of attention she had, but palpably. He came in the front door and went directly to the office, which meant the field notes business was first, which was right and practical. She had lunch on the table at noon. He came to the table. He sat down. He looked at her. "The field notes match," he said. Hector let out a breath across the table. "The 69 surveyor was precise," Will continued. "His field notes described the eastern boundary stakes exactly where Charlotte found them. The 4th stake is documented with compass bearing and chain measurement from the 3rd. Platt pulled it, but the documentation says where it was." He paused. "His lawyer is going to advise him to drop the claim." The table was quietly, collectively relieved. Will looked at Charlotte. "Your drawing was accurate to within 2 feet," he said. "I know," she said. Hector made a sound that was close to a laugh. Caleb grinned. Charlotte poured coffee and kept her face even and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing measured and done correctly, which was one of the few satisfactions she trusted entirely. After lunch, when the table was cleared and the hands had gone back to work, Will stayed. He stayed the way. He sometimes stayed with the slight deliberateness of a man who has things to say and is choosing his moment. And Charlotte kept working because it was easier to have difficult conversations when her hands were occupied. "I've been thinking," he said. "I gathered. In Cheyenne." He was standing near the door, which was his usual position for these conversations, close enough to engage, far enough to leave if the engagement went badly. She had catalogued this about him. "I had 6 days of writing and legal offices, and a lot of time in between to think." She kept working. "I thought about the ranch," he said, "about what it needs, about the things that were wrong before you came and what's different now." A pause. "The cattle are healthier. The kitchen runs well. The fence line is documented and legally protected. The men are settled." He paused again. "I thought about what changed." "The water drainage improved," she said. "Charlotte." She put down what she was holding. I was looking at her with the gray eyes that she had learned to read, and that were currently saying something she had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. And she thought very clearly, here it is. Here is the part I don't know what to do with. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as my cook." The kitchen was very quiet. "Will, I know what you're going to say," he said, "that you're not a prize, that you won't be chosen out of gratitude or obligation. I heard you the first time and you were right, and I've thought about it carefully enough that I know the difference between gratitude and what this actually is." He moved away from the door, which was unusual. He came closer, stopping at the near side of the table, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. "I want you to stay because when I was in Cheyenne, I thought about coming back and you not being here, and it was not acceptable. That's the honest accounting of it." She looked at him. "You could hire another cook," she said. "I don't want another cook." He held her gaze. "I want to talk to you at 5 in the morning about broken fence lines. I want to argue with you about cattle and survey stakes and whether the bread damper is properly calibrated. I want to know what you find when you go to the creek on Fridays, and I want to go with you sometimes, if you'll let me." A pause. "I want to know you. I've started knowing you, and I don't want to stop." Her hands were flat on the table. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had not cried since the spring her father died, and before that, since Henry, and she was not going to cry now in this kitchen over a man she had known for 8 weeks, because that would be excessive, and she was not an excessive person. Her eyes were wet. She looked at the table. "I'm not easy," she said. "I have opinions about everything. I'll tell you when you're wrong. I won't make myself smaller because it's more comfortable for other people." "I know," he said. "I don't fit the picture most people have in their heads of what a woman in your position should—" "Charlotte." His voice was quiet and final. "I know. I know all of that. I'm asking anyway." She looked up at him. He looked back at her with the patience of a man who has said the true thing and is now waiting for the other person to decide what to do with it. And she thought about Henry, who had always said, "The right person will ask you to be more yourself, not less." And she thought about 6 years of houses that weren't hers, and kitchens that weren't hers, and Friday mornings at water that wasn't the right water. And she thought about what it felt like to be told, "Whatever you're looking for, you don't have to look alone." "I need more time," she said. Something moved in his face. Not disappointment, something more respectful than that. He nodded. "Take it," he said. He walked out. She stood at the table with her flat hands and her wet eyes, and the very specific feeling of a person who is holding something fragile and trying to determine whether they are strong enough to hold it without dropping it. What happened next, she did not anticipate. The Friday that followed was the first Friday that someone came with her to the creek. She had not invited him. She had not planned it. She had been crossing the yard in the early morning, cloth bundle in hand, when she passed the barn, and Will stepped out with his hat already on and fell into step beside her without asking permission and without explaining himself. She looked at him. "I thought about it," he said. "I thought you might not want company. And then I thought that I said I wanted to go with you sometimes, and that was an honest thing to say, and I'd rather ask and be told no than not ask." She walked. "You can come," she said. They walked to the creek in the early morning without speaking. She stood at the bank and took out the dried prairie clover she'd gathered the day before and placed it at the water's edge. She stood for a long time. Will stood beside her, not touching, not speaking, just present in the way of someone who has decided that presence is what is needed, and anything more would be intrusion. After a while she said, "He would have liked this valley." Henry. He liked high ground and open sky. She looked at the water. He would have been insufferable on a horse, though. He had no patience for slow animals. Will made the not-quite-laugh sound. Thomas was the same, he said. About everything, not just horses. The world never moved fast enough for him. She looked at the water. "I think they would have been friends," she said. "I think so too," Will said. The quiet that followed was the kind Charlotte had thought for 2 years and 4 months she would never find in a shared space with another person. The kind that doesn't require filling. The kind that holds grief without drowning in it, and memory without making it into something it wasn't, and the particular bittersweet business of loving someone who isn't there anymore, with the full knowledge that they are gone, and the world is still in some complicated way good. She breathed. She did not expect what happened next. What happened next was boots on the ground behind them, multiple sets moving fast, and she turned to find Caleb and one of the older hands, Pete, coming down the slope with the urgent gait of people who have been sent somewhere quickly. "Platt's men," Caleb said, breathing hard. "They're at the north fence, 6 of them." Will was already moving. "Armed?" "Pete thinks so, at least 4 of them." Will looked at Charlotte for one moment. A look that was complicated and quick, and contained a great deal of what the morning had been, and then he was walking, and she was walking, and the creek was behind them. They reached the north fence line to find Hector already there, and the 6 men Caleb had described, and a situation that was not yet violent, but was carrying the particular electricity of something that was very close to it. Platt's men were not there at Platt's direction. This was the thing Charlotte understood in the first 30 seconds before anyone had explained it. The men were hired guns. She could see it in their posture, their equipment, the way they held themselves in relation to the property line with the careful confidence of men who are being paid for a result, rather than representing an interest. Platt had hired them because his legal claim was collapsing, and he had moved to the only other option he had. Will knew it too. She could see it in the set of his jaw. "You're on my property line," Will said. His voice was steady and clear. "State your business or ride out." The man at the center, the one with the silver conchos on his belt, who was clearly in charge of the others, looked at Will with the assessing look of a professional. "Mr. Platt is unhappy with the situation," the man said. "He's asked us to communicate that unhappiness directly." "I see," Will said. "And what does direct communication look like to Mr. Platt?" "It looks like a final offer," the man said. "Sell him the south pasture at his price. Walk away from the boundary dispute. In exchange, things stay quiet." The word quiet sat in the air with its full implication. Charlotte was standing slightly behind and to the right of Will. She was counting 6 men, the positions they were holding the fence line between them. She was thinking practically the way she thought when something needed doing, rather than debating. She was also thinking about something else. She stepped forward. Will moved to stop her, a quick, instinctive, protective gesture, his hand briefly on her arm. She met his eyes. "Trust me," she said with the look. Just that. He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he stepped back. She walked to the fence. The man with the silver conchos looked at her, not with the same dismissal as Platt, the professional appraisal taking in the situation. "The south pasture isn't for sale," Charlotte said. Her voice was clear and even and carrying. "Mr. Harrison's title to that property has been documented and submitted to the Territorial Land Office, with original survey field notes confirming the boundary line. Whatever Mr. Platt told you about the status of this dispute, he didn't tell you that." The man looked at her. "What Mr. Platt has done," she continued, is remove a legally documented survey stake from its recorded position, which is destruction of territorial property record, and he has sent armed men onto a property where the legal title is registered and confirmed, which is trespass and intimidation under territorial law. She paused. I want to be clear about what that means for the men standing in front of me. Whatever you were hired to do here today, you are doing it in a situation where the legal record is unambiguous and documented, and where there are 7 witnesses on this side of the fence. Nobody moved. Whatever Mr. Platt is paying you, she said, is not enough to be on the wrong side of a territorial court filing. She looked at the man in charge directly. That's the full picture. I'd encourage you to make your decision accordingly. Silence. The man with the silver conchos looked at Will. Will said nothing. He looked at the man the way he looked at most things, steadily and without embellishment. The man looked at his crew, an exchange of looks that lasted no more than 3 seconds. Then he looked back. Platt's got bad information, he said. Platt has had bad information throughout this matter, Will said. The man considered this. Then he touched his hat brim, not quite a gesture of respect, but something in that neighborhood, and turned his horse. His men followed. Charlotte stood at the fence and watched them go. The silence after they left had the specific quality of a very close call that nobody wants to be the first to name. Then Pete said from somewhere behind her, with the tone of a man who has just watched something remarkable from a safe distance, Lord have mercy. Caleb said nothing. He was staring at Charlotte with an expression she recognized, the same one Hector had worn at the water trough the first week, the same one Will had worn the morning she'd secured the horses. The expression of people revising a category. Hector looked at her and said simply, "Good." Will came to stand beside her at the fence. He looked at the road where Platt's men had gone, and then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was not surprise. She had stopped surprising him. She thought somewhere around the survey stakes, but it was something deep and specific and personal. "You didn't need to do that," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "You put yourself in front of them. Someone had to say it plainly." She looked at him. "And I knew what I was saying." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, so that only she could hear it, "Charlotte." "Don't," she said. "Not here." He nodded, understood. They walked back together. The thing was done, and Platt would hear about it by evening, and his lawyer would hear about it by tomorrow, and the formal withdrawal of his boundary claim arrived at the Harrison Ranch 6 days later in a letter that was terse and graceless and constituted a complete capitulation. Hector read it aloud at supper to a table of men who responded with the specific satisfaction of people who have watched a protracted and stressful situation resolve in the right direction. And someone produced a bottle that had been kept for a significant occasion, and Charlotte served pie she had made that morning with dried apple and cinnamon, and a crust that came out exactly right, and the evening had the quality of a room where people are genuinely glad to be in the same place at the same time. Later, when the kitchen was clean and the house was quiet, Will came in and sat down. He did not have his hat this time. He set it on the table, which was something she had noticed he did when he was not planning to leave quickly. She sat down across from him. "I have something to say," she said before he could. He waited. "I'm not easy," she said. "I've said that. I meant it. I have a specific way of being in the world, and it doesn't diminish for other people's comfort, and I've spent 6 years learning not to apologize for it." She looked at her hands on the table. "But I've also spent 6 years being careful about what I wanted, and whether it was reasonable to want it, and whether the wanting itself was a kind of foolishness given everything." She stopped, restarted. Henry used to say that careful was good until it became a way of not living. Will was very still. "I think he was right," she said. She looked up. Will was looking at her with an expression she had no existing category for, something that was warm and certain and held very steady, the way he held most things that mattered to him. "So," she said, and her voice was almost entirely steady. "Ask me again, properly." He looked at her. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, not clasping, just placing warm and deliberate and unhurried. "Charlotte Whitaker," he said, "will you stay?" she breathed. Yes, she said. The word was simple, and the evening was quiet, and outside the window, the Wyoming summer was doing what it had been doing all along, indifferent to the small and enormous things that happen inside houses, inside kitchens, between two people sitting across a table from each other, with their hands touching, and the specific, terrifying, necessary courage of having meant what they said. She stayed. That was settled. What was not settled? What was still moving, still shifting, still building toward something neither of them had yet found the words for, was everything that came after. Staying was not the same as being settled. Charlotte understood this the morning after she said yes, when she came into the kitchen at 4:30 and started the bread and felt the exact same complicated mixture of certainty and fear that she had felt the night before, and understood that saying a true thing out loud does not make the truth easier to carry. It just means you're carrying it openly now, which is a different kind of weight. Will was at breakfast at 7, same as always. He poured his own coffee. He sat at his end of the table. He talked to Hector about the south pasture rotation and to Pete about a fence section that needed restringing before the fall. He did not look at Charlotte differently than he had the morning before, except that once when she set the bread on the table and turned back to the stove, she felt his eyes on her with the specific quality of attention that is not casual. And when she glanced back, he was already looking at his coffee, and the corner of his mouth had done the thing it sometimes did. She went back to the stove. Caleb watched this exchange with the expression of someone who has figured out a puzzle and is trying to decide whether to announce it. She gave him a look that she had perfected over years of managing young men in other people's kitchens. The look that says, you will keep that observation entirely to yourself, and he applied himself immediately to his breakfast with great concentration. The day moved the way. Days do when something important has happened, but the world has not yet registered it ordinary on the surface, with a different current running underneath. What she had not accounted for was the town. She should have accounted for the town. Harlow Creek was small. Small meant everyone's business was everyone's business by the following morning, and the business of the Harrison Ranch cook and the Harrison Ranch owner was more interesting than most. She learned this on Wednesday when she went to the market for supplies and walked into a particular quality of attention, not hostile, not warm exactly, but sharp. The way attention is sharp when it is tracking something it wants to understand. The woman at the dry goods counter, a Mrs. Hartwell, who had never been directly unkind, but had also never been direct in any other direction, either served her with a slightly elevated brightness. "Heard the Platt business is settled," Mrs. Hartwell said. "It is." "Heard you had something to do with that." A pause freighted with secondary inquiry. "The survey work and such." "The ranch had something to do with it," Charlotte said. "I helped where I could." Mrs. Hartwell leaned on the counter with the ease of someone who has decided they are having a conversation whether the other party wants one or not. "Will Harrison's a good man," she said. "His father before him. They've both been good for this valley." Another pause. "It'd be nice to see him settled." Charlotte counted out her coin. "I'm sure it would," she said pleasantly, and took her goods and left. She was halfway down the boardwalk when she nearly walked into Meredith. Meredith, the sandy-haired woman from the market, the one Will had silenced publicly 6 weeks ago, stopped. They looked at each other. The boardwalk between them held the memory of that earlier morning, the way certain spaces hold the memory of what happened in them. Meredith looked at her, at the market basket in her hand, at the general direction of the Harrison Ranch 4 miles north. "Miss Whitaker," she said. "Mrs. Meredith is fine." The woman's chin came up, then came back down, a small movement that Charlotte recognized as someone overriding their first instinct in favor of their second. "I said something cruel at this market some weeks ago." "You did," Charlotte agreed. "I'm not here to explain it," Meredith said. "I'm here to say it was wrong." She held Charlotte's gaze with the effort of someone finding it difficult. "You've done right by this town. The Platt situation. If Harrison loses that water, half the ranches in this valley are vulnerable. People know that even if they haven't said so." Charlotte looked at her. "Thank you," she said. Not warmly, she was not going to manufacture warmth she didn't have, but genuinely. Meredith nodded once, walked on. Charlotte stood on the boardwalk for a moment and thought about what it cost people to say they were wrong, and whether it cost them the same thing. It cost her to hear it, and then she walked to the wagon and drove back to the ranch. She told Will about it that evening. She had gotten into the habit of telling him things in the evenings, not consciously, not as a decision, but as a natural consequence of him being the person she wanted to tell things to, which was a situation she had not been in before and was navigating without a map. He listened the way he listened to everything, which was completely. "Meredith Cook's not a bad person," he said. "She's a frightened one. There's a difference." "I know the difference," Charlotte said. "I know you do." He looked at her across the kitchen table. "Does it change anything for you, being here?" She considered the question seriously, the way he always asked things that deserved serious consideration. "It changes the texture of it," she said, "not the substance." She looked at her hands. "I didn't come here for their approval." "I know," he said. "But it's easier without their disapproval," she admitted. "I won't pretend it isn't." He nodded. He understood practical things. It was one of the qualities she had come to rely on, that he didn't require her to be above ordinary human experience, didn't need her to be indifferent to things that reasonably affected a person. "What about Victoria?" she asked. Something moved in his expression. "What about her?" "She came here while you were in Cheyenne. She spoke to me." He was still. "She didn't tell me that. I didn't expect she would." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "She told me she wasn't a villain. She told me not to let anyone make me small." A pause. "I think she meant it." Will looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, She's made hard choices for a long time alone. I understand what she was proposing and why. I don't think she's wrong about herself exactly. I think she wanted the wrong thing for the right reasons." "And Delia," Charlotte said. He met her eyes. "Delia wanted the right thing for the wrong reasons," he said. "She wanted to feel settled. She thought coming back here would give her that. But settled isn't a place. It's not something someone else can give you." Charlotte breathed. "No," she said. "It isn't." The Friday that followed was the 7th Friday she had walked to the creek in Harlow Creek. Will came again. He had come every Friday since the first time 3 weeks before, and they had found a rhythm for it. She walked. He walked beside her. She stood at the water. He stood beside her, and they talked about Henry and Thomas, and the particular way that grief settles into a life over years, until it becomes part of the foundation, rather than the wound. It was the most unusual and the most honest conversation she had ever had on a recurring basis, and she had stopped being surprised by how much she needed it. This Friday was different. She knew it when they reached the creek, and she took out the dried clover and placed it at the water's edge, and stood, and Will was beside her. And instead of the usual settling quiet, there was something else in the air between them, something that had been building for weeks toward a moment that neither of them had yet named. She was looking at the water when he said, "I want to ask you something." She kept looking at the water. "Then ask," she said. How was quiet for a moment. She could feel him finding the words, the careful, specific process she had watched him apply to everything that mattered. "I told you I wanted you to stay," he said. "You said yes. I have been glad of that. Every day." She breathed. "But staying as what you are now is not what I'm asking," he said. "And I think we both know that. I think we've both known it for a while." She looked at the creek. "Charlotte." His voice was quiet and certain. "Will you marry me?" The world continued. The creek moved. The morning held. She had prepared for this. She had been preparing for it in the back of her mind, since the night he put his hand over hers, since the fence line, since 5 in the morning, with the gray sky and the horses, since the rain on a Friday 4 months ago, when he had asked her what she was looking for, and listened to the answer. She had prepared for it, and she was still not ready. "I need you to understand something first," she said. "All right." She turned to face him. He was looking at her with the steady gray eyes, and there was no performance in his expression, no anxiety, no theater. Just him present, and real, and waiting. "I am not a woman who becomes less of herself because she belongs to someone," she said. I will have opinions, and I will say them. I will manage this ranch the way I manage everything, which is completely and without asking permission. I will go to this creek every Friday for the rest of my life, and I will bring flowers for Henry, and I will stand here as long as I need to, and I will not explain myself to anyone who doesn't understand why." She held his gaze. "I need you to know what you're asking for. All of it. Not just the parts that are easy." He looked at her. "I know what I'm asking for," he said. "I've known for some time. That's why I'm asking." She breathed. "You've seen me at 5 in the morning in the rain fixing a fence," she said. "I have. You've seen me stand in front of hired guns at a property line." "I have. You've seen me cry," she said. This was the hard one. Her voice stayed even. "At this creek. You've seen that." "I have," he said. "And I'll see it again. And I'll stand here when you need me to, and give you room when you don't." She looked at him. She thought Henry would have liked him. The thought arrived with its grief attached the way it always did, and the grief was real, and it didn't diminish what she was feeling right now. It lived alongside it, the way grief and living learn to share space when you've carried both long enough. "Yes," she said. Will released a breath that told her everything about how steady he had been holding himself. He reached into his coat and brought out something she did not expect, a ring, simple and silver with a small setting that held a piece of blue stone she recognized. Blue like the creek. She looked at it. "It was my mother's setting," he said. "The stone is from the creek bed. I found it the morning after you told me about Henry." He paused. "I've been carrying it for 3 weeks." She looked up at him. "3 weeks," she said. "I was waiting for the right moment." 3 weeks is a long time to carry a ring." "You're worth the wait," he said simply. She held out her hand. He put the ring on. They stood at the creek in the Wyoming morning, with their grief and their history and their horses and their survey stakes and everything they had said out loud to each other that could not be taken back. And Charlotte looked at the ring on her finger and at the water moving past, and thought of Henry, who had always run toward the thing in trouble, who had gone into the ice for a sheep. He could have left and never come back. "You were worth it," she told him silently. "All of it. Even the part that hurt." The creek moved. She felt standing there something she had been afraid might be permanently gone, the specific sensation of being in the right place. Not a perfect place. Not a place without grief or difficulty, or the work of two people learning to share a life honestly. But right in the deep sense that has nothing to do with easy and everything to do with real. They walked back. What happened when they arrived back at the ranch was not what Charlotte had anticipated, though she understood it the moment she saw it. The hands were in the yard, all of them. Hector, Pete, Caleb, the older hands, who rarely gathered without reason. They were standing with the specific casualness of people who have gathered for a reason. They are pretending is not a reason. And when Charlotte and Will came through the gate, Caleb's face broke into the wide, unself-conscious grin of someone who has been waiting for this exact moment and cannot help himself. Hector looked at Charlotte's hand. He looked at her face. He turned to Will with an expression that was the most emotion she had ever seen on him and said, "It's about time." Will said, "Mind your business, Hector." "This is my business," Hector said. "I've worked this ranch for 14 years. The state of it is my business." He looked at Charlotte with the warm, direct regard of a man who has made up his mind about a person and is not revising it. "Welcome to the Harrison Ranch, Miss Whitaker. Properly this time." "It's still Miss Whitaker until we're married," Charlotte said. "Of course," Hector said. "That's a matter of weeks." "Hector," Will said. "I'm just observing." Caleb said, "Congratulations," with such genuine and uncomplicated happiness that Charlotte had to look away briefly at the sky, at the practical and indifferent Wyoming sky, and compose herself. Pete shook Will's hand. The other men nodded and dispersed with the efficiency of people who have done the thing they gathered to do. Hector lingered. "There's a letter," he said to Will. "Came this morning. Territorial Land Office, final confirmation on the boundary filing." He produced it from his shirt pocket. Platt signed the acknowledgement. "It's done." Will took the letter. He looked at it. He looked at Charlotte. "Read it," she said. He read it aloud briefly. The dry legal language of a matter finally closed the boundary, confirmed the water rights registered in the name of the Harrison Ranch, as they had always been, and Charlotte listened with her hand in her coat pocket, touching nothing. Because the ring was on her finger now, and there was nothing in the pocket, and the absence of the cloth bundle she had carried for months felt different than she had expected. Not like loss, but like something laid down voluntarily. She still had the creek. She would always have the creek. But the thing she carried to it now was different. Not heavier, not lighter, just accompanied. "It's done," Will said. "It is," she agreed. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since 5 in the morning months ago. The way she had been learning to be looked at, without deflecting it directly, specifically, with the full intention behind it. The town came to know the news by evening. This was Wyoming, which is to say, it was a small place with short distances between people, and news of the Harrison Ranch engagement reached Harlow Creek by supper time, through the specific telegraph of people talking to other people while going about their ordinary business. Charlotte did not go into town that day. She had work, and she had the kind of interior quiet that large events produce, sometimes the strange stillness after something significant has been decided. She was in the kitchen at dusk when Victoria Caldwell's horse came into the yard. She heard it and stepped to the window and watched Victoria dismount with the composed, careful movements of a woman who has decided how she is going to conduct herself before she arrives. She came to the front door. Charlotte heard Will answer it. She went back to the stove. 2 minutes later, Will appeared in the kitchen doorway. "She'd like to speak with you," he said. Charlotte looked at him. He said, "I'll be just outside." She went to the front room. Victoria was standing. She did not sit this time, which meant the visit was going to be brief, which Charlotte appreciated. Victoria looked at her at the ring briefly, then at her face. "I heard," Victoria said. "I expected you would." A pause. Victoria's composure was fully intact, but Charlotte had learned to read underneath it, and underneath it was the specific effort of a woman who is doing something that does not come easily. "I want you to know," Victoria said that what I did the proposal the way I conducted myself in this situation, I am not proud of all of it. She held Charlotte's gaze. "And I want you to know that when I told you not to let anyone make you small, I meant it, including me." Charlotte looked at her. "I know you meant it," she said. "I'd like to start again," Victoria said. "As neighbors." A beat. "I am not easy company. I've been told this." "Neither am I," Charlotte said. Something that was almost a smile moved across Victoria's face. "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine you are." She pulled on her gloves. "Congratulations, Miss Whitaker." "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell." Victoria left. Charlotte stood in the front room for a moment, thinking about the strange and imperfect way that people correct themselves, not cleanly, not entirely, but in the specific and difficult increments of someone who has decided that the person they have been is not entirely the person they want to be and is moving toward the difference. She went back to the kitchen. Will came in from outside. He looked at her face. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He moved to pour coffee, and she was at the stove, and the kitchen held them both with the ease of a space that has been shared long enough to stop being navigated and start being inhabited. And she thought, this is what it is. Not the proposal, not the ring, not the legal confirmation in the letter. This. The ordinary evening of two people in a kitchen where they both belong. The wedding was 3 weeks later. Not a large affair. Will had no interest in theater, and Charlotte had no interest in spectacle, and the ceremony at the Harlow Creek church was attended by the ranch hands and a handful of townspeople who came because they meant it, rather than because occasion required it. Hector stood beside Will. Charlotte had no one to stand with her, which she had known and accepted before she had spent 3 minutes thinking about it. And then Hector's wife, a quiet woman named Rosa, who had fed Charlotte dinner twice during the Platt business and asked nothing in return, appeared at her elbow the morning of the wedding and said simply, "I'll stand with you if you'd like." And Charlotte had said yes before the sentence was entirely finished. The ceremony was short. The words were the words. When Will said "I do," he said it the way he said everything that mattered, without ornamentation, with complete intention, looking at her directly, so there was no possibility of misunderstanding. When Charlotte said "I do," her voice was steady and certain, and she meant every syllable with the full weight of a woman who does not say things she doesn't mean. Afterward, in the yard of the church, with the summer afternoon around them, and the hands gathered, and Rosa squeezing her arm, and Caleb grinning. The way Caleb always grinned. Hector shook Will's hand and looked at Charlotte and said, "You saved this ranch." She looked at him. "The ranch saved itself," she said. "I just helped it see what it already had." Hector smiled a real smile, the kind she had not seen from him before. "That's what good people do," he said. Will reached over and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture. Not public performance. Just his hand taking hers in the easy way of a man who has decided where he belongs and is standing there. She held it. The last Friday of their first week as a married couple, she went to the creek. He came. He always came now, and she had stopped having feelings about it other than the simple, steady feeling of rightness. She placed the flowers wild prairie rose she had found near the fence line pink and fragrant at the water's edge, and she stood and he stood beside her. "I have something to tell him," she said. Will waited. She looked at the water. "Henry," she said quietly. Not loudly, she had never spoken to the creek loudly. This was not performance. This was private, and Will being present didn't change that because he understood the difference. "I'm all right. I know you always thought I would be even when I didn't," she breathed. "I found someone who runs toward the trouble instead of away from it, like you did." A pause. "You'd have argued with him about everything, and then decided he was right and never admitted it. He'd have known anyway. He's like that." The creek moved. "I'm all right," she said again. "I wanted you to know." Will's hand found hers the way it always did, now warm and unhurried. They stood at the creek for a long time. They walked back. At the top of the rise before the ranch came into view. Charlotte stopped. Will stopped beside her. She was looking at the sky, the Wyoming summer sky, that she had been looking at every morning for months without quite letting herself believe she had a right to it. The sky of a place she had arrived at with $12 and a letter and a cloth bundle of dried flowers and the grief of a brother she hadn't been able to find. She had found something here instead. She had found water that felt like the right water, and a man who asked the right question, and a kitchen that was hers, and a fence line with documented stakes, and a Friday morning ritual that now had a companion. She had found against all reasonable expectation. The thing that practical women sometimes forget to keep looking for in the business of surviving, the thing that makes surviving different from living. She had found that she was not in fact the sum of what other people saw when they looked at her quickly. She was the sum of what she knew, what she had learned, what she had survived, and what she could do with her hands and her mind and her particular way of paying attention to the world. She had always been that. It had just taken this place, this man, this creek, to make it visible. Will looked at her, looking at the sky. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at him. She thought about every kitchen she had worked in that wasn't hers. About the 4 miles she had walked in the July heat with her canvas bags, and the 43 seconds on the boardwalk before the first cruelty, and the water trough she had diagnosed from a fence line, and the fence she had fixed at 5 in the morning in her working clothes, and the survey stakes she had found with her hands in the dry ground, and the hired guns she had talked down with a clear voice and accurate facts, and the creek she had walked to every Friday for 2 years and 4 months alone. And she thought about Henry, 17 years old, and running across the ice toward a sheep that needed him, and she thought, "I understand now. That is what love is. Running toward instead of away. Every time. Even when the ice is thin." She looked at Will. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." He looked at her with the gray eyes that didn't lie and didn't embellish, and saw her entirely, not the shape of her, not the category, not the story. Other people told about women who looked like her and worked like her and arrived in towns with $12 and a cloth bundle. He saw her. Charlotte. The woman who ran toward the trouble. "Yeah," he said. That word, in his voice. Quiet and certain and meaning everything. "Yeah, she agreed. They walked home. The Harrison Ranch received them the way it always did now, with the ordinary breathing life of a place where people are working and eating and arguing and resting and beginning again each morning. Caleb was in the yard. Pete was mending something near the barn. Hector came out and looked at them both and nodded once with the expression of a man who has seen things go right and is not going to make a performance of his satisfaction about it. Charlotte went to the kitchen. She started the bread. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, the flour, the measure, the working of the dough, and outside the window. The Wyoming summer held the valley in its long light, and the creek moved 4 miles north, and the survey stakes stood where they had always stood, marking the line of what belonged to whom, and the ring on her left hand caught the morning light when she turned the dough, and she did not stop to look at it, because she didn't need to. She knew it was there. She knew where she was. She knew what she was worth, not because anyone had finally told her, not because the town had revised its opinion, not because a good man had asked the right question, though all of those things had happened. She knew because she had always known somewhere underneath the years of careful management and quiet survival. And what this valley and this kitchen and this creek had done was not teach her something new, but remind her of something true. A woman's value is not in her size or her silence or her willingness to make herself small enough to be comfortable for other people. It is in what she does with what she knows and who she chooses to run toward, and whether she can stand at the edge of hard water and say, "I'm all right," and mean it. Charlotte Whitaker. Harrison meant it. She had meant it on a Friday morning at a creek with a ring on her finger and a man beside her who had asked her what she was looking for. She had meant it in a kitchen in Wyoming at the beginning of a life she had not planned and could not have imagined and would not have traded. She meant it completely. She always would.